Some cases slip away like a whisper, fading into history with barely a murmur. Others wound you, leaving scars you carry long after the trial ends. But then there are cases like this, cases that dig in their claws and never let go. Cases that haunt your sleep, that poison your thoughts in the quiet horrors of the night. The case of Albert Fish was one such case. This was not the story of an ordinary criminal, not a man who killed in rage or passion, or even for profit. No, Albert Fish was something else entirely. He was a specter of human depravity, a being whose hunger for suffering was so profound, so unnatural, that it defied understanding. The trial was meant to be a reckoning. But how does one weigh justice against horrors that no punishment could erase? The families of his victim would never be whole again. No verdict, no sentence could undo what he had done. But it was all we could give them. It all began with Grace Budd. June 3rd, 1928, the air in New York City was thick, the kind of summer that clings to your skin like a second layer. The Budd family lived in a modest apartment tucked away in a working-class neighborhood. Their world was small but full of warmth. A home where doors were left unlocked, where strangers were given the benefit of the doubt. And that is how the devil walked in. He called himself Frank Howard, a frail elderly man with kind eyes and a voice as soft as velvet. He introduced himself as a wealthy farmer in the need of strong hands to help on his property upstate. He spoke of honest work and steady wages, of fresh air and promise. Edward Budd, the eldest son, had placed an ad in the paper looking for a job. And here was his answer. But Albert Fish had not come for Edward. The moment his eyes landed on Grace Budd, everything changed. She was 10 years old, a child of sunlight and laughter, still untouched by the darkness of the world. She could not have known that she was already lost the moment he saw her. He charmed them all. He spoke of the hard but honest life on his farm, the opportunities, the future he could offer, and then, with the ease of a seasoned predator, he spun his lie. He attending a birthday party for his niece that afternoon, he told them, wouldn't Grace like to come along just for a few hours? Just for a bit of fun. The Budd saw no reason to doubt him. He was, after all, a harmless old man. They dressed Grace in her best outfit, while stockings a pale blue dress. A ribbon in her hair. She was smiling as she took his hands, waving back at her parents as they disappeared down the street. They dressed Grace in her best outfit, while white stockings, a pale blue dress, a ribbon in her hair. She was smiling as she took his hand, waving back at her parents as they disappeared down the street. That was the last time they ever saw her alive. The days that followed were a walking nightmare. The days that followed were a very dark walking nightmare. The Budd searched, begged, pleaded for answers. Posters were plastered across the city. Her face staring back from telephone poles and shop windows. The police followed every lead, every whisper. But Albert Fish had vanished. And then silence. For 6 years, the Budd family lived in that silence, trapped in a purgatory of not knowing. Hope twisted into despair, and still no answers came. Until the letter. November 1934, it arrived without warning, addressed to Grace's mother. The paper was yellow, the handwriting careful and deliberate. At first glance, it seemed an ordinary piece of correspondence, but as Mrs. Budd read the words, she collapsed. November 1934, it arrived without warning, addressed to Grace's mother. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting careful and deliberate. At first glance, it seemed an ordinary piece of correspondence, but as Mrs. Budd read the words, she collapsed, screaming. The letter was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was something far worse. A gift from a man who wanted them to know every detail of what he'd done. He wrote of taking Grace to an abandoned house where no one could hear her screams. He wrote of stripping her, of how she had wept, how she had begged. And then, the worst of it, words so vile, so nightmarish, that even the most seasoned detectives had to set the letter down, fighting the bile rising in their throats. He had killed her slowly, tactically, and then in an act of unthinkable depravity, he had cooked her flesh, eating her slowly. It was a confession, but it was also a taunt, a victory lap. He had carried this secret for 6 years, and now he wanted them to know. But it was his undoing. The envelope bore an insignia, a small, nearly invisible mark from a business where Fish had once worked. That was all we needed. We found him in a boarding house, sitting quietly, as if he had been waiting for us all along. He did not resist. He simply smiled, as though amused that his game had finally come to an end. And then the horrors truly unfolded. Albert Fish did not kill only Grace Budd. She was but one of many. He spoke to us casually, openly of his crimes. He told us about the voices in his head, the commands from God. He spoke of the needless, the dozens of long, rusted needles he had driven into his own pelvis, where they remained buried deep in his flesh. He told us of the children he had tortured, of the ones he had consumed. He spoke of it as if it was nothing, as if he were recounting mundane details of his day. And we listened, because we had to. The trial was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with horror, with revulsion. The public had never heard of crimes like these. They had never imagined that such a monster could exist amongst them. His defense argued insanity, that no sane man could do what he had done. But I stood before that jury and told them the truth. The jury deliberated only a few hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty, and then the sentence, death. January 16, 1936, Sing Sing prison. The last night of Albert Fish's miserable life. They led him to the electric chair, his frail body folding in on itself under the weight of his own sins. When asked for his final words, he smiled and said, "I don't even know why I'm here." The switch was pulled, and then, finally, silence, but never peace. Because men like Albert Fish leave shadows that never fully disappear. His crimes linger in the minds of those who heard the story, who saw the evidence, who read his words. The world learned, in those dark days, the true monsters do not lurk in nightmares. They do not hide in the woods or under beds. They walk amongst us. They shake our hands, and they smile. And sometimes, they hold the hands of little girls, walking them into the abyss while their parents watch, believing foolishly that they are safe.